Greetings and salutations! In this video, I'm going to show you how to format USB drives on your Linux system. This also applies to all kinds of SD cards as well. We're going to use 3 different tools and 3 different methods. The first 2 are graphical, and then at the end of the video, I will show you how to do this 100% from the command line. There are a lot of different tools out there, and there are a lot of different ways to approach this. I've chosen the 3 methods that I think are the simplest, and which one you want to use is entirely up to you. The first tool that we're going to look at is called Disks. It ships with pretty much every GTK-based desktop out there. It's Gnome Disks. Gnome-Disks is the name of the package in Ubuntu and Debian if for some reason you should have to install it. I'm using Linux Mint 20.3 today, so you'll notice that we have a slightly older version, which means that it automatically picks the first drive it finds on the list and loads it up. In this case, it's the main drive for my system here. We don't want to mess with that. If we screwed that up, that would make for a really bad day. So let's make sure that we pick the right drive. And we're going to be working with a SanDisk Cruiser 64 gigabyte drive. It's just a very simple, basic USB drive here. And it's blank. There's nothing on it at all, which is a bit unusual because usually even when you buy them new, they have something on them, but I have blanked it out. And I'll show you how to do that later in the video. So we're going to choose this little hamburger menu up here, just 3 dots on top of each other, and we want to choose Format Disk. Notice it doesn't say Format Partition, it says Format Disk. That means we are creating a partition table. If there was any data that was on this disk and we did this, it would disappear. We do not want to write zeros. That takes a very long time, especially with USB drives. And then we have the option to choose a type of partition table. We're going to go ahead with msdos. You could choose GPT if you wanted to, and you knew that this drive was going to be used on Linux systems only. Go forward. And it asks me, do I really want to do this? And yes. And it doesn't take long to write a partition table. It's done. So the next thing that we want to do is click on this little plus down here under this graphic representation of what's on the drive, which right now is nothing. And we click the plus, and this will allow us to add a file system. And we have some decisions to make. First of all, how many partitions do we want? Usually, most folks want one big partition, unless you have a particularly large USB drive. So we're going to go with that. Do not choose extended partition. That is something that has to do with the DOS partition table. It allows it to have more than 4 primary partitions. If you don't understand what that is, don't worry about it. If you are using a particularly large drive, I would suggest using GPT because there's a limit to how much DOS MBR can address anyway. You know who you are. You'll know when you need it, right? So we can give our partition a name here, and we're going to call it 64 GB USB. And yes, you can use spaces. And we're going to choose an internal disk, which means it'll be formatted with ext4. We could also choose NTFS if we knew this drive was going to be used on Windows. If you're going to run any kind of disk utility to fix the drive, you need to do that on Windows because Linux can read and write to NTFS, but it can't repair the file system. FAT32 is pretty much compatible with everything around the world. Just to keep things relatively simple here, we're going to go ahead and do that ext4 file system. We're going to assume that you just want to use this with Linux, but choose whichever one works for you. Like if we go to Other, you might want to have XFS on your drive for some reason, or ButterFS, or Linux Swap, whatever. They give you all kinds of choices here. We're not going to password protect the disk, and we're going to go ahead and format it. Now this will take a few minutes to happen. There's a lot that goes on. formatting ext4, we have to create a journal. We have to set up an inode table. All kinds of things there. So it's done. That did that very quickly, and it's not mounted, it says right here. We do that by just clicking this little play button, and this will mount this partition, and the desktop is going to open up a window here shortly once it figures out what's going on. Or maybe we have to do that manually. Let's see. There we go. Let's see if we have access to it. And the answer is yes. We're going to go ahead and open this into a terminal, and I'm going to show you how we have access to this. And that is, we're going to make that just a tiny bit bigger. We're going to ls, and we're going to look at the directory above the one that we're in, and we are going to use the long option. And you will see that the tool has set it up that we are the owners of this particular partition. So every time it mounts up, this is how it's going to do it. And nobody else can read or write to it. They may be able to see some files, but they won't be able to do anything with them. So it's very secure. That's how that is set up. So our drive is ready to use at this point, and we don't have to do anything else to it. So we could create a new folder here. Just call it whatever, junk, and start putting files in it. Let's go ahead and unplug that drive. And we're going to move on to another way to do this, which some folks might find a little bit easier. And that is, we're going to use a tool called Gparted. By default, Gparted is not installed on your system. However, it's available on the live disk, because a lot of people use this to set up their drives before they install the operating system on them. Most of the time you're going to have to install this yourself, but it's super easy. If you're on Ubuntu or Linux Mint or Debian, just sudo apt install Gparted. Okay, I unplugged that drive and plugged it back in. We're going to now open up Gparted. And what did I do wrong there? There we go. Type it correctly. It's going to ask for your password because you have to have root privileges from the start to use this. Okay, and the first thing that we see, kind of like disks, is that it has selected our drive, our main drive that's SDA. We're going to select the drive we want to work on, which is, in this case, SDB. And it says that we have a nice blank drive. Now, whatever's on this drive, we can delete it. First, we want to make sure that we unmount the drive. Okay, so it's not hooked up to the file system anywhere, so we can do whatever we want to. Now, all you have to do to blank this drive out, you don't have to delete this or anything. Just go in here, and we want to create a partition table. We're going to choose msdos. And yes, we have GPT and many other different types of systems that we can choose from here. Just stick with MS-DOS. It's the easiest one. Now apply. If you do have a very large drive, like I said before, then you probably want to use GPT, but you know who you are. So now we have completely unallocated space on this drive. And so I just right-click here, and I want to create a new partition. We'll use the entire drive space. Okay, we want to create a primary partition. And we want to, in this case, we could do ext4, or we have more file system choices than before too. Here, you notice that. We're going to stay with ext4 just to keep it consistent. And we want to label this 64 GB USB, same as before. And then we go ahead and add that. Now, Gparted actually hasn't done anything. What we've done is set it up to do this. To make it work, we have to kind of turn it loose here, and that is we use this button right here that says apply all operations, or we could go back. Okay, we can undo the last operation if we look at it and go, that's not right. And that's one of the reasons I like it. It's very flexible. So we can now apply all this, and it'll say, do you really want to do this? Yes. And pretty much we're going through exactly the same process we did before. So the first thing it's doing is creating a primary partition. It says the operations are now complete. We can close that. And all we have to do, now that that is done, is close Gparted, and we will unplug the drive and plug it back in. Okay. And it should find it and mount it up. Now, if we right-click here, you're going to notice that unlike before, we don't have permission to write here because what we created is owned by the root user. This is those permissions in Linux that keep you safe. This is one of the ways that they do it. So what we're going to need to do here is give ourselves permissions to make this happen. And the easiest way to do it is just to use one command from the terminal, and I'll show you what that is. So we're going to open this location in the terminal, okay? And what we're going to do is we're going to do sudo change mode without the E, so it's chmod, and we're not going to change the ownership. We're going to go ahead and let root own the drive because we're going to do this a little bit of a different way. This is how I like to do it because with my USB drives that have ext4 on them, I like them to be compatible with all kinds of different machines so I can share files. That's the whole point. If it's all locked down and just for me, if I plug it in a machine that I don't have an account on, then we got a problem, and then I'm going to have to go in and do some weird stuff to make that work. So we're going to leave it owned by root, but we're going to set the permissions to 777, which means that everybody can do everything. They can read, write, and execute everything. And then to do that, all we do is select the current directory, which is a dot. It's that simple. And then we are going to put in a password. And it's done. To make sure that it writes and make sure that it's there, hit sync. And now we can either just pull the drive out, or we can go ahead and unmount it and plug it back in, which is, I think, what we'll do. So we unmount the drive, and it says volume is busy. That's because we have it opened over here in the terminal. So if I CD out of that, that would go away. But we're going to go ahead and say force anyway because it's fine. Now, we can unplug the drive, plug it back into the system to reset it. Let's see what happens now. Now when I open it up, notice that I can create files. And now I can share this with everybody. There you go. Pretty cool, huh? Now, the next way we're going to do this is completely from the command line. So let me go ahead and switch desktops, which is super easy to do. I have my cheat sheet here, which I'm going to put in the description for this video. So what I'm going to do first is I want to blank out the disk. And if you need to completely make a hard drive unreadable and you want it blank, this is a quick way to do it. This is a dangerous command, boys and girls. It's DD, which in a past video I called the disk destroyer. So do be careful. The first thing that we want to do is open up a terminal, and we're going to find out where our disk is. So let me make this slightly bigger, and we're going to do lsblk or lsblk. And you'll see that our disk is SDC. It's not SDB anymore. Now, the reason why that happened is because I have plugged it in and unplugged it, and sometimes the system will get a little confused and it'll think there's two drives in at the same time, and there's not, so it'll give it the next drive letter. So in this case, it's SDC. That's very important, and make note of that so you know exactly what drive you're working with. Now, we're going to use DD to blank this drive. I'm going to copy this command and I'm going to paste it in here. I'm going to change this to C because in my notes I have everything as SDB. So yeah, you need to make sure that you know what drive you're working with before you do this. And we're just going to turn this thing loose and see what happens. Right now it is writing zeros. Now what it did there was, because it took just a few seconds to do that, this is a USB 2 drive. This should actually take a little while because we're writing 2 gigabytes to it, okay? What it's done is it's written it to memory. So to make it actually do it, we will use the sync command. And sync just basically forces the system to write everything in the buffer to whatever drive is plugged in. So we'll turn that loose. This should take a little while. I'm going to pause while it does. That actually took a little time for it to write all of those zeros to that drive, but now that we've got it all written, we can unplug it and plug it right back in, and the system will not be able to find anything on it because it's a blank drive. This is a good way of obliterating anything on a drive, and the reason why you write 2 gigabytes of stuff is just to make sure that you wipe out all the partition tables, anything at the head of the drive. Now that doesn't mean that somebody couldn't come along later and like pull some of that off if they were an expert at digging for things on drives, but for the average person it's pretty much done. So we're going to go ahead and see where our drive is now that I plugged it back in. Let's use lsblk. Do this frequently so you know where you're at, folks, because it's very important. This drive once again has come up as SDC. In my example, I have it set as SDB, so we'll have to change that each time, but that's okay. So the first thing that we're going to do is put that in there. This is our first command. What this is going to do is create that partition table we were working with before. And that is done, even though it says we need to update the FS tab. We do not, because this is a removable drive. Next thing we need to do is create a primary partition. The other way that you can do that with Parted, by the way, is to open the program and then issue commands. We are issuing commands one at a time to Parted, and it's doing it and it's exiting. But most of the documentation will tell you to do it in such a way that you open the program. But Parted tends to be a little bit cryptic, and I've found that this is pretty much the easiest way to do it. So let's go ahead and change this once again to C, this particular command. And that is done. Make sure it wrote. We can sync again. You're noticing a trend here. We got to sync a lot to make sure that before we move on, we're doing something different. Next, we're going to create an ext4 file system, and we're going to do that using the makefs command. You could choose a lot of different file systems here. You could make fs, ntfs if you want to, fat32. There's many to choose from, but we're just following the same example and doing ext4. So we'll put that in there. And then we're going to come back and once again change this to C. Make sure it'll work. And it is currently creating the ext4 file system on that drive. This is doing exactly the same thing as the graphic applications. We're just giving it direct commands. So Gparted, for instance, is nothing more than a graphic front end for the software that we're using right now. When you make choices with Gparted, this is what you're sending it. Okay, the file system is there. The next thing we would like to do is label our file system, right? So let's go ahead and do this once again. Now you can do spaces if you want to from the command line. And I didn't have that in the example, but I'll show you how to do it here in the video, okay? So we are going to change this to C again. And instead, we actually want spaces, right? So all we have to do is use the except character, which is the backslash, like so. And now we can put spaces in. So let's go ahead and do that. It's done. And once again, we'll just run sync to be super safe, because this machine has a lot of memory in it, so therefore it'll buffer a lot of things that it is going to write to block storage. And that way we can just make sure it's done. And then I will unplug the drive yet again, and this time it should mount up. And yes, we have that. Oh, I forgot to put USB, so it says US. Haha, forgot the B. All right, once again, we end up with a situation where we don't have permission to get in here. This time, instead of navigating to it using that, we'll do it this way. So first of all, we need to figure out where this drive is mounted. We'll do lsblk again. And you see that it's in Media, Joe, and there's our drive, right? Okay. So what we need to do here is to navigate to that drive, and we're just going to CD, and we'll go to Med, and I'm using the tab to fill in there, and Joe, that's where that's mounted. These are all virtual folders, by the way, that don't really exist. And the next one we need to go to is 64. It'll fill in the rest, and it does. So we're going to go in there, and now we are in that directory, and we shouldn't find anything except a file called Lost and Found, which is auto-generated whenever you make an ext4 file system. Now we want to have permission to use this drive, and once before we just use exactly the same command. So what we're going to use is sudo change mode without the E 777, and we use the current directory. And it's done. So now what we should be able to do is unmount that drive. Let's do that. And when you run the mount or the umount command, you can either tell it the directory that it's mounted to, or you can tell it the device. In this case, we're going to tell it the device, SDC1. So I want to unmount that. Well, it says the target is busy. Do you know why? Because we're actually in that directory right now. That's the current working directory. The system is trying to protect itself. It doesn't want the current working directory to go away. So we'll hit CD, which will just take us to the home directory, and we will rerun that command one more time. Now that is unmounted. I will unplug that drive, and now let's see if we can use it like we were using it before. Okay, right click. Yes, we have permission. So that means that we can create a new directory here and call it junk. So there are 3 different ways to work with USB drives. All right? How do you do it? Put it in the comments below. If you have any suggestions, put them down there as well. And if this video was useful to you, please share it. Give it a like. It helps a lot, boys and girls. We'll do it again soon. Thanks for watching.